Well, welcome. Welcome to the 10th Annual Westover Capital Economic Summit. Speaking on behalf of Matt and Chip and our wonderful staff, I can tell you that it's really great to see all of you here in person. It's really nice. We have many clients, old friends, some new friends here visiting, and I want to give a special shout out to a couple of them, if you will, please. First, I want to start with folks behind the scene that really help us, the Wilmington Country Club, who puts on this magnificent event. And secondly, our wonderful event planners, Paula and Dana Events. Thank you both very much for what you've done. And we have today a wonderful, esteemed attendant, the Mayor of Wilmington, Mike Przicki. So Mike, stand up and take a bow. Since our last summit in person in 2019, Westover has added several people to our wonderful staff, and I just want to give them a shout out. First, Kelly Dorn over here with the waving hand. Kelly serves us behind the scenes doing compliance work and online work for our clients. She helps Dennis Perdue in tax matters. And I love people with interesting backgrounds. So here Kelly is, having worked 6 years at Rockefeller Trust and Trust and Administration, and she helps me in those kinds of things for our Westover clients. But her major in college was a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, with a minor in sculpting. So shout out to you. And shout out also to Dennis Perdue. Dennis, where are you? Are you here? Dennis, stand up, please. Dennis is a CPA. He joined Westover in November of 2019, and he's added the third leg of our three-legged stool to our wealth management offerings. We obviously do investment advisory work. Chip runs that shop. We do financial planning and wealth management. Matt runs that shop. Where are you, Matt? You're over here. And now Dennis helps us with our tax consultation and tax preparation. His background is that he's a graduate of the University of Delaware, local kid made good. He was a principal and a partner in both Master Sidlow and Wisman Giordano. And most importantly, he was the Sawyer family and Westover Capital's accountant for many years before he joined us. So welcome, Dennis. I'm often asked, who's the typical Westover client? What is the profile of your prototypical client? Well, you have 6, 7, 8-figure accounts that you ask us to entrust us to manage, and we do that with great care, I hope. We've just spent 3 months talking with you in regard to our annual reviews. And typically Matt and Chip and I will spend an hour or two talking with you, reviewing what happened in the preceding year from a portfolio performance perspective, and also what we think the economic market outlook will be for the coming year. And when the last of those reviews was ended last week, we did a little debriefing amongst ourselves, and we came up with certain traits that you all have. And this is sincere, and I want you to think about this. The first is that you're decent. Now, that shouldn't be such a hard thing to do, but in this day and age, unfortunately for many it is. Believe it or not, the word slimeball has been used in political discourse now by both the Republicans. President Trump called James Comey a slimeball, and by the Democrats, Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, when running against a Republican, referred to him as that. You guys are decent, you're civil, so thank you. The second is that you're open. You're open to new ideas. You're open to hearing new ideas, and even sometimes those that you may not agree with. And that, again, is a comment on your integrity as far as we're concerned. And the third is you're intellectually curious. When we talk with you, we find out so many things. Every client has a different story. You love to travel, you love to explore, you love to be stimulated by new thoughts and ideas, and we thank you for that. But finally, the most important thing to us is that you have a real concern for your own families, and many of you for the community in which you live, and the services you can afford those communities. I would be remiss if I didn't say, for example, Charlie McDowell. Charlie, where are you? You're right here. Charlie McDowell is running a remarkably large, important project called Reach Riverside on the east side of Wilmington. I could go on and on and on, but you get the idea. So,
I didn't pay him for that.
so if you're not a Westover client and our message resonates with you, please check one of us out after the talk today. Speak with us over cocktails. We would love to see if we could be a fit for you. You know, the clients that we do have done such a nice job trusting us that we were the largest growing registered investment advisor in Delaware last year for advisors to $100 million. So thank you. Now to the speaker, Greg Valliere. We've had some wonderful speakers in the past, and Greg has graced this stage twice before, in 2013 and 2016. And it's not a coincidence that he comes back again, because we send surveys out. You'll get one probably tomorrow or the next day, and we ask you a series of questions, one of which is, what did you think about the speaker? And universally, Greg, the comments we receive about you are really positive. So it's great to have you. He, if you don't know, he is the policy strategist for AGF Investments. He joined them as the chief U.S. policy strategist in 2019. He's been advising investors and about Washington policies for more than 30 years. He's a regular contributor to CNBC, CNN, Fox, Bloomberg, and he brings a unique perspective to investors by analyzing the policies and practices in Washington and relating those to your everyday occurrences. And what I especially like is that there's no spin. It's not a leftward spin or rightward spin. It's just, this is the way it is. You can like it, you can't. This is the way it is. So I appreciate that. He's got a lot to talk about today, doesn't he? Think about the issues of the day. We've got inflation at 8.5%, which is the highest rate in 40 years. We've got mortgage rates, which are now over 5%, and you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that 15 months ago, they were the lowest in history. And now they're the highest they've been since 2011. We've got Federal Reserve, who's embarked on taking away the punch bowl and administering, some would say, a little bit of castor oil to try to keep inflation in check. We've got a yield curve that's inverted that may suggest that we have a recession on the rise. It may not. We had an article today in the Wall Street Journal suggesting that the Fed's challenge for avoiding a recession is going to be a tough one, a very tough one. Energy prices have gone up 32% in a year, 32% in a year. There are 11.3 job openings, jobs going waiting. That's 4 million more than before COVID. And speaking of COVID, the government, both Republicans and Democrats, for good reasons and not, have added $6.4 trillion to our federal deficit trying to attack COVID. And as I was thinking today, I was trying to put that number in some kind of a perspective. You say a number, 6.4 trillion, what does that mean? So here's what it means. If you took $1 trillion bills and you put them end to end, they would stretch out exactly 96,906,656 miles further than from the Earth to the Sun for $1 trillion. We've got the war in Ukraine, we've got immigration. I think I saw that the number of arrests this past month were 209,000, which was the most in 2 decades. We've got midterm elections coming up. I'll be interested in hearing what Greg has to say about that. We've got, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because he's Delaware's own, but we've got a president right now who's unpopular with the general public. We'll have to see what comes of that in the next 2 years. So he's got plenty of subject matter material to address, that's for sure, does he not? So please welcome Greg Valliere.
Excuse me 1 second. Get this on. Yeah, I'm going to use it. Well, first of all, happy to be out of Washington in a place where people are decent and civil. That was, that's quite a change for me, so very glad to hear that on this lovely spring afternoon. Good to see all of you and my friend Murray, and I'm so happy to hear your firm is doing well. Couldn't happen to a nicer person. I have to excuse myself initially. I have a scratchy throat. I've been running a lot this spring, and the pollen is off the charts. So every morning I wake up with a scratchy throat because I've been breathing in pollen. So please excuse that. Well, needless to say, there's an enormous amount, as Murray said, of things to talk about. And quite candidly, even though I'm a glass half full person, I like to see a glass half full or 3/4 full. It's a real challenge this afternoon to talk about things in a positive light. There are a lot of things going on that I consider deeply troubling, starting obviously with this horrible, barbaric war in Ukraine. I wish I could tell you that the war will end soon, but I've talked to people in the administration who are increasingly worried that the war could be a protracted one for weeks or months before there's any resolution. Both sides, I think, have big vulnerabilities that will be exposed. I think right now Ukraine has to worry that the next huge battle in the Donbass area is on fairly flat ground, not a lot of forests, different from the territory around Kyiv, where the guerrilla tactics worked devastatingly well for the Ukrainians. I think also the supply lines for the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass area have to go through hundreds of miles to get there, whereas the Russian supply lines are a lot closer. Although losing a big ship certainly hurt their morale beyond any question. I think the Russians have negatives as well, including morale of its troops, most of whom were told this was going to be a peacekeeping effort. They had no idea what they were getting into. I think it's logical to say that Ukrainians, men, women, young, old, are willing to die for their country. I have to ask the question, how many Russians are willing to die for Vladimir Putin at this time? I would submit probably not very many. So with bad morale on the battlefield, I think the Russians also have to worry about the sanctions. Not a lot of publicity in the last couple of weeks on the sanctions. Putin seemed to think he could survive them. Well, there was one heck of a story this morning in the New York Times. I'd highly recommend talking about what the sanctions are doing to Russia right now. People not having the standard of living and nowhere close to the standard of living they were used to, not having credit cards, not having goods, Russian businesses facing high unemployment. I think the sanctions, and I said this when the war began, I think the sanctions will lead to a depression, capital D, a depression for the Russians by the end of the year. They've been cut off so badly. Putin, I think, recklessly thought that NATO would not be united, and NATO is very much united. And while I may say a few critical things about Joe Biden this afternoon, I give him credit for putting NATO together. Even Germany has been maybe dragged kicking and screaming on energy, but even Germany has been a pretty good member of NATO, and I think came as a shock to Putin. I think that the seeds have been planted for an eventual deal. I've been saying this for a while, and obviously there's no deal, and there won't be any imminently, but I think the seeds are there. That would include Zelensky, what a great, great hero, deciding that he would be willing to make a commitment that Ukraine would not join NATO. That's something that I think would be in a final agreement. There would have to be some security arrangements for Ukraine. I think that the Russians, though, are going to insist on at least a sliver of land in the east, in the Donbass area, which they already occupy largely. There's not a lot left, of course, in Mariupol, but I think the Russians would insist on some of that territory as part of any deal. Considering the appalling torture and murder of innocent civilians, I don't think Zelensky's in any hurry to cut a deal with Putin. I think that's going to take quite some time. I think he feels he can win, and to be frank, I think that Putin cannot win this war. I think that even if he gains more territory, he will be a pariah forever. Russia will be a pariah throughout much of the Western world, and their losses, I think we're up to 8 or 9 generals who have been killed. Their losses have been staggering. And I think that ordinary Russians are now seeing funerals of their sons, brothers, relatives, daughters, and I think these funerals will continue to sour the public opinion in Russia. Putin badly miscalculated. I think one other thing I would just add is that as we go into the summer, if this war is sustained, and I'm afraid it will be, we have to worry about 2 shortages that will keep the markets unstable. The first, of course, is energy, natural gas, oil, things like that I think will be coal, that I think will persist. The other thing that worries me almost as much is food. I think there will be a shortage of food, considering the fact that Ukraine and Russia are big producers of food and fertilizer, which is in very short supply. And I think that whether it's North Africa or the Middle East or wherever, there's going to be an acute shortage of grain, and that means people are not going to have enough bread. And I think a food shortage will be one of the parts of this story. So with that likelihood of inflation continuing, let's move on to the next issue, which of course is inflation. And I would say that the Fed has got, beyond any question, a really tough task, as Murray said, and the Wall Street Journal wrote about this morning. I think that inflation is not all things. It's not gold or timber or aluminum or grain. They can go up and down. The one part of inflation, to me, that's more intractable, that will persist, is wage inflation. I think the labor part of the inflation story, even though people would like to see even higher wages to compensate for inflation, I see almost a vicious circle, a vicious cycle here with inflation. And I always bring up the story of my sister in New England who owns a restaurant, and a lot of her employees started quitting last summer. They said, we're going to have a few months off. There were a lot of very generous benefits, and my sister lost her employees and had to then go out and offer far higher salaries, and she was paying pretty well to begin with. She had to offer sign-up bonuses. She couldn't find any cooks, waiters, waitresses, busboys, busgirls. She finally got a few back. She barely kept her restaurant open, but the only way she could survive was to raise prices on her customers to pay for all of these benefits. And I think this acute shortage of labor is going to be an issue keeping inflation on the high side through the rest of the year. We're going to see big COLA increases, cost of living adjustments. We're going to see Social Security COLA go way up. We'll have another big year like we had last year on Social Security. So I do think that the wage pressures will continue, and the Fed, I think, knows that. I think they can get inflation under control by the end of the year, or at least see it starting to come down. Maybe it goes from 8.5 now down to 4, 3.5. That's still high, but I think the trajectory would be fairly positive. The only reason we get that trajectory is obviously the medicine that the Fed is going to have to impose on the economy. We get a 50 basis point rate hike in a couple of weeks in early May. That's about the safest bet of the year. In fact, there was one Fed governor yesterday said, well, why don't we make it 75? And I think Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, would not want to surprise the markets. That's a cardinal sin for a Fed chairman or chairwoman, is to say, here's a surprise. Markets don't like to get surprised. So I think it's 50 basis points in early May, another 50 basis points toward the end of June, maybe still another 50 or 25 as we get into the late summer, early fall, and maybe still more rate hikes through the rest of the year. These rate hikes are going to be rapid. They're not going to end quickly. We now see the Treasury 10-year bond yield. I didn't see it this afternoon, but we're getting close to 3%. And I think the yield still is not that devastating. I think our economy and real estate can survive with a 3% Fed funds rate or 3% Treasury 10-year bond yield, but it will persist. And I think the real fear in the markets is that the Fed could overdo it. This is going to be tricky. The Fed could do too much and lead us into a recession. We haven't had one for a while. They come with great frequency. You can't get by a decade or so without one, and maybe we're due for one. And if there is one, I think the Fed raising rates will be the major factor. And that, I think, would begin to take the unemployment rate back up after going down to 3.6, I believe it is right now. So the Fed story, I think, is one that the market has to be concerned about. The market will listen very carefully to every word that Jerome Powell says. I know Powell, I like Powell. I think that the Fed was too naive, too sanguine on inflation a year ago. They said inflation was transitory. He's now banned the word transitory. But I do think that the Fed knows they've got a lot of work to do to catch up. So here you've got inflation, perhaps a lengthy war, Fed raising rates. That's not a real great story for Joe Biden, is it? So let's talk a little bit about politics and where that stands. First of all, Murray's right. I'm neither on the left nor on the right. I think I'm a cynic more than anything else after all of these years. There's only a handful of politicians that I really like. Maybe the mayor of Wilmington would become would join me on my list. But there's a lot of reasons to be cynical in Washington. And I would have to say right now, there are two big political stories. So let me spend a couple of minutes on these stories. The first is the near certainty, and I rarely use the word certainty, but the near certainty that the House of Representatives will flip back to the Republicans. They only need about 5 seats. I said all during the winter they probably would, and I said maybe the Republicans would pick up 15. I was way too low. I've been talking to people on Capitol Hill now who feel that it might be more like 25 or 30 seats. Many reasons. First and foremost is just historical patterns. Every first-term president in his first midterm election usually loses 20 or 25 seats. That's to be expected. We also have some redistricting. I keep changing my mind on redistricting. The new story now is that the Supreme Court has allowed House members and state House members to set the districts. So I think Republicans will probably gain a handful of seats from redistricting, which of course comes from the census of a year or so ago and gave more seats to a state like Texas. You also have, in addition to redistricting and the historical trend, you also have a lot of issues that are not breaking well for Joe Biden. First of all, the issues themselves. We've talked about inflation. I'm not sure it's entirely his fault. Every major country in the world has inflation, but if you're the quarterback and the team's not doing so well, you get the blame, whether you deserve all of it or not. You've got urban crime. A very intriguing new mayor of New York City gave a lot of Democrats hope that they could rid themselves of this idea that they all want to defund the police, which is not true. And lo and behold, Eric Adams in New York has seen an enormous tidal wave of crime over the last month, month and a half. Very disturbing. So that's an issue that doesn't help the president. We see continued gun violence every weekend. There were several incidents, as you all know, in this past weekend. We see a story on the Texas border that has gotten many Democrats, we're up to about a dozen Democrats who were begging Joe Biden to not waive this Title 42. If he did, that would probably lead to a big surge of illegal immigration. And I think the president has to acknowledge the anxiety that a lot of Democrats have, especially Democrats running for re-election. And I think he may make a change there. So there are a lot of issues that are not helping him. And then you look at the polls. I must confess, I'm a poll junkie. Before I take a shower in the morning, I look and see if there's a new poll out in the Washington Post. The polls have looked quite alarming for Joe Biden, especially one from Quinnipiac University a couple of days ago. They have Biden at 33%. That's the lowest I've seen. It may be a little bit of an outlier, but a lot of other polls show him in the mid to upper 30s. That's not where you want to be in an election year, to be under 40. That's Trump territory. So I think that doesn't help, and the internals in the polls don't help either. I would say that the most shocking internals I've seen in the last few weeks is Biden's numbers among Hispanic voters and his numbers among young people. So it's not a pretty picture. I think that the Democrats will lose maybe 30, 35 seats, not out of the question. If that happens, that would mean, of course, that the president's ability to get much done would be pretty much dead. I cannot envision Kevin McCarthy being real cooperative, being, what did Murray say, decent and civil. So I think that the House will be an albatross for the president going into his second 2 years of this term. Way too early to make a call in the Senate, I must confess. A lot of races I can't figure out. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia. Is Herschel Walker really going to become senator from Georgia? A lot of Senate races I can't figure out. So the Senate is tied, as you know. So that it may be well into October before I'm willing to make a prediction on the Senate. But the House, to me, is a pretty easy call. So then that raises the second issue, the second big political issue, and that is Joe Biden's political future. If the Democrats are hit hard during the election, I think the speculation will really pick up that he will be a one-term president. I know he told Obama, it's in Politico today, when Obama was at the White House last week, Biden told Obama that he's going to run. He's got to. He can't say, I'm not going to run. The moment he says that, he'd be a lame duck. But I would have to point out, not that I'm a spring chicken, but I must point out that Biden turns 80. 2 weeks after the November election, in late November, he turns 80. If he won a second term, he would be leaving the White House at the end of that second term at the age of 86. That's pretty old, and that's pretty unprecedented in most political history. So I think that it's not just age. I think his health's okay. I mean, everyone speculates about his cognitive abilities, but I'm not a doctor. I have no idea. I have friends who have been in meetings with him who have told me he's sharp, he's on top of the issues. But that's a big issue for Fox. They're going to make a big deal over maybe some cognitive problems for Biden. But I think his bigger problems are going to be the movement away from him on so many issues. One last thing I'll say on politics. I'm a political junkie, as you may know. I would say that the one thing I can't understand about Biden, who's an amiable guy, decent guy, is that he ran as a moderate. He got inaugurated as a moderate, and then by March or April, he embraced the progressives. And embracing the progressives backfired on many issues. If you look at some of the key issues that the progressives have been fighting for, they failed on most of them. Defund the police, failed. Wealth tax, failed. Medicare for all failed. The list goes on and on and on of things that the progressives wanted that Biden endorsed and didn't get. And it energized, it motivated a rambunctious senator from West Virginia. Don't get me started on all of the stuff I know about Joe Manchin, but I think it pretty much doomed the president to a reputation that he couldn't get much done. In fact, he did get quite a few things done, including putting NATO together, including aid for infrastructure, things like that. So if Biden decides not to run, and that's my bet, and you can hold me to it. If he decides not to run, the obvious question is, who's going to replace him? I must tell you that many Democrats in private who tell me they think Biden's not going to run also tell me they've been disappointed with Kamala Harris. I have other friends who think she's becoming more seasoned. Maybe she's starting to show a little more gravitas, but the consensus is she has not been dazzling in her first year and a half. So I'll be damned if I can figure out who would replace him. The Washington Post this weekend ran a list of the 10 most likely replacements. Number 2 was Buttigieg. Harris was 3rd. Who else? Elizabeth Warren was 4th. Amy Klobuchar was on the list. And someone no one's heard of, who I think is intriguing, the governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. I think he could be a player. But this is not the 1927 Yankees in terms of a really strong bench here. I'm not sure who is on the bench for the Democrats. Well, while I'm right at it, let me just say, I'm not convinced that Donald Trump is going to run. He says he's going to, but he has a mountain, a tidal wave of litigation that he faces, some of it going back to January 6th. Some of it is attempted intimidation of officials in Georgia. There's a long list of things, some of his tax practices, a case that stalled out but now has been revived again in New York. So there are issues with Trump. And in terms of age and health, Trump turned 76 in a couple of months, and he does not appear to go to the gym with any regularity. Let's put it that way. So I'm not sure he's going to run. And if he doesn't, there's a dozen Republicans, just as there are a dozen Democrats, who are itching, salivating to run for the presidency, headed by, of course, Ron DeSantis in Florida, a very provocative guy who has desires on the White House, not well concealed desires, and I would say the same about Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and a whole bunch of others. So a very uncertain political climate. Final point, I keep saying final point I make on politics is that the one thing that strikes me is that there's a crying need for fresh blood, for young, and again, I'm no spring chicken, but I see Nancy Pelosi, who's 82, Dianne Feinstein, who's 88, Mitch McConnell, who's 79. That doesn't mean they're not good and they don't know what they're doing, but it's time for some fresh blood. I think both parties need desperately to show some fresh blood, maybe get younger people more energized in the entire political process. Well, enough on the political side of the story. Let me just take a quick look at this. Let me just finish with a couple of positive things, because I haven't exactly been a ray of sunshine this afternoon. So let me say this: with all the things to worry about, the war, inflation, the Fed, political instability, the market it was up 500 points today. The last time I checked, earnings still look pretty darn good, as I'm sure Murray and his colleagues would tell you. The budget deficit, believe it or not, is plummeting. Receipts are quite strong. Spending has tailed off a bit after the orgy of spending we had last year. We spent close to almost $700 trillion last year, but this year the spending desires have gone way down, and again, receipts are way up. And I think maybe most importantly, the economy is still hanging in there. Just an amazing story. I think you'd have to say that all of the stimulus in the pipeline is still being spent in many states California is flush with cash. Gavin Newsom doesn't know what to do with all the money that he has in California. He's going to have a gasoline tax rebate. He's just trying to think of things that he can spend money on. I'm sure that's the same for the mayor of Wilmington. You have just tons of money. But in addition to the states being flush with cash, you have individuals flush with cash. You look at all of the benefits that went out to people last year, and I think individuals, if you look at savings rates, if you look at pent-up spending, desire to spend, that's a big part of the economic story right now. So I think this year we can still grow at 2.5%, 3%, that sort of trend growth, with inflation starting to come down by the end of the year, as people realize the Fed is deadly serious about inflation. I could see the markets, and I could see myself getting more optimistic toward the end of the year, except for one thing, and that's Ukraine. Ukraine has to be resolved. To end on a gloomy note, in looking at the horrific, barbaric things that Putin has done and his soldiers have done, I don't rule out weapons of mass destruction, tactical nukes. I don't rule out chemical or biological warfare. This is a bad story. And I'm hoping and praying that this starts to look a little bit better and Putin comes to his senses. Or I'm praying that some young general, who has seen lots of young generals killed in the last month, decides to maybe slip something in Biden's breakfast, and I don't rule out that. I say half jokingly that he probably needs a full-time food taster to have the first bite or two before he has a meal. But aside from that, I do worry that the war continues for a while. And if it does, that doesn't mean we can't make money in this market, but I think it does mean the market will be fairly unstable until the Ukrainian war is over. So, end of story. I deliberately leave lots of time for questions because that's the most fun for me. And so fire away. I'm sure that, yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Sam. I said earlier that one of your other Beltway insiders was in town here today, a man who you perhaps know, Grover Norquist.
Mm-hmm.
And Republicans go to Grover Norquist for the holy water, the blessing about no tax increases and
Yep.
tax reduction pledges, the same way that Joe is supposed for that kind of blessing. It's really special. That really begins to bring up the issue of taxes.
Yep.
And what do you, with the prospect of the House flipping, the Senate flipping, would we expect to see longer term any structural changes in tax patterns, particularly given the size of the deficit that Joe would be
Yep.
leaving behind?
Well, the old cliche is thank you for asking the question, but I do thank you. I omitted some comments on taxation. And I think that you would have to conclude that the chances of big tax hikes this year have faded significantly. If I had been here a year ago today, I would have said, yeah, you could see the estate tax go up or capital gains. I don't see it right now. A major reason why is that a tax package would have to accompany a new spending package. But I don't see a new spending package. I think it's unlikely that we're going to get, I think Manchin would accept pre-kindergarten benefits. He would accept maybe some environmental stuff. He would certainly favor fossil fuels. There's stuff in a bill that Manchin would support, but there's a lot of stuff he won't support. And he and the senator from Arizona, Kirsten Sinema, have both been quite outspoken about opposing any big tax cuts. So I must say, I think for all of you, for all of us, the chances are slim for a big new estate tax. A big change in the step-up basis is unlikely. A big change in the estate tax, capital gains. There were a lot of proposals that got everybody scared. There's one now that Biden proposed, a billionaire's tax or a millionaire's, I forget what, I guess billionaire's tax. Not going to happen. The votes aren't there for it. That's one of the problems when you have a Senate that's 50-50. So I don't totally rule out, I'll give myself a little wiggle room, I don't totally rule out in the second half of the year a more modest package of spending accompanied by something to pay for it. And that would be an increase of a point or two on exceptionally profitable companies like Amazon, exceptionally wealthy individuals. I don't rule that out, but I think the chances have slipped by quite a bit. One of the dirty little secrets in Congress is on display right now. They're on vacation all the time. They're on vacation now for 2.5, 3 weeks. They take 2 weeks off for the 4th of July. They take 5 or 6 weeks off at the end of the summer, and they're planning on leaving town early this year to go campaign. So I'm not sure that we can get a bill, a tax bill through Congress. I don't think it's because of Grover. I mean, I know what his thinking is. I just think the votes just aren't there. And if they get through this year without any tax increase, you can be damn sure there won't be any major tax increase for the next 2 years because Kevin McCarthy will be controlling the House. So the threat on taxes has diminished greatly. I think the chances are not quite as high that we'd do that. That also probably dooms the Janet Yellen international tax proposal. So again, if forced to bet, I would bet we may not get anything on taxes. Yes, sir.
Give us your thoughts on China.
Sure.
How it relates to the United States, what's going to happen with them and Taiwan, or how does this play in the Ukraine with Russia, impact them, the world, and in particular the United States?
Well, good question. First of all, the mood in Washington is surprisingly bipartisan toward China. Nobody likes them. Not the Democrats or the Republicans. They are deeply suspicious, and with good reason. You look at China's treatment of its dissidents in Hong Kong and in Western China, the Muslim dissidents. You look at China's development of very sophisticated new weapons, these hypersonic missiles. You look at China's eavesdropping into U.S. companies. You look at China's basically, I think, trying to snooker everybody on COVID. China has been very unforthcoming on how it got out of Wuhan. I don't think anybody knows for sure how that happened. So for all of those transgressions, the Chinese are not well liked in Washington. Now, does that mean we can't do business? No, I think we still could do some business. But the next big move in Washington in the next year or so will probably be a bill to help manufacturers compete better with the Chinese. I think there's a feeling that has to come. The big question, obviously, is Taiwan. I mean, that's the big issue. My sense is, and I could be wrong, I could be naive, my sense is that what's happened in Ukraine has shown Xi, the Chinese president, that it is perhaps foolhardy to go after Taiwan in terms of the sanctions that China would get hit with. And militarily, I mean, how are the Chinese going to take Taiwan? An amphibious landing? I'm not quite sure how that would work. So I think that Xi and the Chinese are patient. I don't think he's in any great hurry to go after Taiwan. I think the Chinese are far more pragmatic. Someone had a great line the other day. The Chinese care what's happening to the Dow Jones. Putin could care less. But the Chinese have a pragmatic streak. So I think we can coexist without any big eruption. One final point I'd make is that whenever there's not enough attention given to Kim in North Korea, he does something to get people's worked up. So he probably will be testing more missiles, including these hypersonic missiles. So he could be an irritant. But I think we could have an uneasy relationship with China without any overt hostilities. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Great talk. My question is about unemployment, immigration, and labor markets. Rule of thumb that I've always, heard was 3.5% unemployment was like standard. There's 3% of the people in the world, in our country, who are looking for jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about where you said we are right now. Labor costs are high.
Yep.
They're rising. Employers are struggling to find employees. And so why doesn't it make sense to loosen immigration policy to reduce labor costs? I understand the politics
Yep.
of it, but from an economic and labor market productivity, production standpoint? Your thoughts?
I could not agree with you more. I have friends in California where you can't find any labor, home construction, service sector, an acute shortage of labor, not just California, but everywhere. And yet at the same time, we're aggressively, the Trump administration, aggressively cut back on immigration, legal and illegal. So I would make an argument that it would be helpful for the economy to get more workers in. You know, legal is better, obviously, but I would say that it's something the country needs. And you know, if immigrants come in and help pay for my Social Security, that's fine with me. You know, I have no problem with that. But it is a red-hot political issue. I think it's one of the reasons why Trump won his first term as president. I think that he will go back to that time and time again, claiming the country's overrun. And you know, we're going to see a lot on TV this summer of hundreds of thousands of young kids coming into the U.S. illegally. And it's just too emotional an issue to address it. But from a dispassionate standpoint, I think more immigration would help our labor market probably subdue inflation, keep inflation a little lower. But yes, to you, sir, and then you. Yep.
Is Joe Biden likely to loosen up a little bit on energy self-sufficiency to open our oil pipelines and power plants?
What an irony. What an irony on the energy story. So, well, the question was on energy. Were we going to loosen up our dependence on fossil fuels, things like that? So what an irony. 5 or 6 months ago, all the leaders of the Western world, the industrialized world, went to Glasgow, and they left triumphant that, by God, we're not going to use any of those damn fossil fuels anymore. We're going to stick with renewables. That's where we're going to go. So fast forward to April 19th today, and all of these leaders, Biden, Boris Johnson, Macron, they're desperate for fossil fuels. They want more fossil fuels. Macron's even going to expand nuclear power plants. But the desire for fossil fuels has now affected Joe Biden. And as we saw over this past weekend, he will open up federal land. Some, it's not as much as the industry wanted, but he will open up federal land for more drilling. This has infuriated the environmentalists who feel that he's broken a promise. He would say we have an acute crisis with gasoline, we have a war, and therefore we have to, you know, desperate times require desperate measures. So I think that Biden will probably not, it's a lose-lose for him. The industry is going to say he's not doing enough, and the environmentalists are really angry. In fact, the chief White House environmentalist, Gina McCarthy, is going to step down in the next few days, it's been reported. She, like many of the environmentalists, are very disappointed in this administration. So but he's between a rock and a hard place on that one. I see it was another hand. Yes, sir.
You opened your politics segment with us saying you're going to talk about a couple items. One you didn't mention that seems to me to have a potential for really tossing things over this summer is the January 6th Commission and the possibility of public hearings.
Mm-hmm.
You see that shaking things up in the next few months, especially since the House will be anxious to get that done before the midterm election.
Well, first of all, I'd say on the January 6th Commission, it's been more aggressive and more productive than most people expected. They certainly have found a lot, and there's more to come. Knowing Trump, I think he'll say no matter what, it's a witch hunt, it's fake news, it's all, you know, it's all made up. And you look at the extraordinary numbers for Trump in the House of Representatives among the Republicans who would not be part of any kind of real prosecution of him. So can the evidence that's been gathered go to the Attorney General? And could this become a much bigger story? Yeah, I don't rule it out. It's been, I mean, I haven't read everything, but in reading the accounts of this, it's pretty juicy stuff, and I think some people have to be held accountable. Whether Trump's held accountable or not, hard to say, but the Democrats are putting up a bigger and better fight than I expected on this.
I'm thinking particularly of possibility of public hearings and
Yep.
that might change
Yep.
how people see what's going on.
The thing is, though, you could put Trump in front of a public hearing and his job numbers would go up. You know, go figure. But, yes, sir.
Where do you see
Yeah, I think that the new Iranian leadership has been very provocative in its rhetoric toward the U.S., but they would like a deal. Here in the U.S., there's a growing fear that the Iranians are literally only a few weeks away from developing a crude nuclear bomb. You know, the delivery system is unclear, but they're getting closer to developing a nuclear bomb. And this obviously concerns the Israelis and just about everyone else. So I think on that one, I think there still could be a deal. There'll be a lot of opposition in Congress toward it. But even if there is a deal, it would be naive to consider Iran all of a sudden an ally. They still are extremely aggressive in the Persian Gulf, hitting Israeli tankers and other oil tankers. So even if we get a nuclear deal, I wouldn't be too optimistic about the Iranians. I think they're a deadly serious adversary of ours. Other questions? I'm going to get the hook in 1 minute, so we'll take one last question. And I'm going to be around and having a beer or two, so be delighted to talk then. Yes, sir.
Will Hunter Biden raise his Armani suit or orange suit?
Yeah. Well, it's been nice seeing you. I don't know how to answer the question. I mean, I've read a lot of accounts. The Washington Post, which is hardly a conservative newspaper, had a detailed story on Hunter Biden and his relations with the Chinese. Something smelled pretty bad. I don't know if he's going to be indicted. Some people think he's going to be indicted. I don't know. But added to all of the problems Biden has, you know, the border, inflation, crime, he's got Hunter Biden. And I can guarantee you that the new House, if it's controlled by the Republicans, will immediately begin hearings, impeachment hearings on Joe Biden. And one of the issues they will hit hard on is Hunter Biden. It was one more. Let's take one more. Then, yep.
You touched on China politically. I'm interested, as long as China maintains a zero COVID policy and continues to shut down major cities, especially Shanghai, basically indefinitely, one of the largest cities in the country, why is no one talking about the supply chain issues and inflationary pressures that go along with that policy?
The inflationary implications are complex with China. Their sea carriers are half empty now because they're not producing anything in Shanghai. They can keep the country clamped down because they got all the guns. And I think that the country's ready to blow with huge anger on the part of the public. But I don't consider that to be that inflationary because the Chinese aren't producing things that are being shipped here. We're not selling things there. I think I would leave it at that. But again, as I said to the gentleman over here, you can't sugarcoat China. I mean, they're hardly an ally of ours, and their unwillingness to speak out on what Putin is doing, I think, speaks volumes about where they really are. You've been a great audience. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.